It's John Vallance, and I'm the State Librarian. And the very, very warmest welcome to all of you to the State Library from me, and also from my colleagues from Emilia Joseph and the other people from Public Library Services who have been working on this wonderful early literacy framework which is being launched today. I'll start with something very important. I am a hugely patriotic Australian. I love my country as much as anyone, but I don't like our national anthem. And the second line of our national anthem in particular sticks in my throat a little bit, the line that goes, "For we are young and free." I am with that 9-year-old girl in Queensland who last month or the month before last was threatened with expulsion from her school. She was attacked on talkback radio. She was condemned in the Senate in Canberra for pointing out that we're not young at all, that we have in our midst one of the most ancient civilizations on Earth. And not just ancient, you who work in the Public Library Network know as well as any that Aboriginal Australia is very, very much alive. Wherever I go visiting public libraries, I see evidence of that. So I start by acknowledging that we're on Gadigal country, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and also emerging. And this is something that you're going to be very much involved with today. An important point with which to start. I am very pleased to be able to welcome our friends from Macquarie University, Dr. Emilia Djonov down here, Professor Jane Torr and Dr. Murray Stenglin, who've been working with us, I think, for nearly 4 years now on this wonderful project. I have quite a bit of experience of Macquarie University's work in this area because in a former life I used to run a couple of schools, and we made a lot of very, very productive use of research coming out of Macquarie University. And even before that, on a personal level, one of my children was a guinea pig in one of the Macquarie University childcare centres where they were sort of peering at him through one-way glass and watching his interactions with text. And so I have a number of interactions historically with Macquarie, and I can't think of a better group of people to be advising us on this important work. One of the things that I enjoy most of all about my job as State Librarian, and I'm only just over 1 year old in the job, in spite of my appearance, is the opportunity it gives me to discover my home state. Off to Tamworth and Armidale on Thursday, Friday of this week. Then I'm off to Coffs Harbour again. I've been all over the place so far, and everywhere I go, I see evidence of the vigour, the enthusiasm, the life in public libraries. And everywhere I go, I see that story time, story areas, reading areas for very small children are a focal point of the library. They are all evolving in different ways to suit the different communities, but they're all there. It's really quite striking. We, as you may know, are doing quite a lot of the work in this area here. This library traditionally has been quite user unfriendly. One of the problems with big state libraries is that they're the sort of place that you can only really use if you know what you want before you come. You've got to say, I want this, you fill out a form, you wait, and it gets delivered to you. And we're trying to change that, and we're trying to change that for readers of all areas, but we're putting a lot of work into precisely what you're interested in today, and that is young children. We've invested a lot in a new learning centre. We've got a project to build a children's library, a dedicated children's library, which we're going to get started on early next year in another part of this building, which I'm hoping is going to form a standard collection of the very best in writing by Australians for our children. And we've also got a 0 to 5 story time area in the historic Mitchell building next door. It was quite interesting. I saw on Instagram where someone put up a picture of a very small child being read to in our little story time venue. And one of the Instagram commenters said, "Isn't this shocking that the great State Library of New South Wales is so debased now that they're reducing themselves to reading stories to young children?" Well, I can't think of a more noble mission than to put resources into reading stories to young children and also making sure that young children learn as quickly as they possibly can how to read stories for themselves and read stories for other people. So this work the results of which are being launched today, is extremely important to me. Congratulate Miley for all the work she's done in shepherding it through at our end. I think you're in for a really interesting day. And so welcome and have a wonderful, productive time. Thanks.
Okay, just some very quick housekeeping things. If you have your phone with you, as I do, ready to tweet, please make sure it's on silent. In the event of an emergency, our assembly area is actually in the domain, so you'll follow State Library staff out. There's an exit there, an exit there, and an exit here, and congregate under the trees in the domain should anything happen, any alarms or anything go off. The toilets, for those of you who haven't visited us before, are just out on this side, so if you went out that door, you'd be right there. And we do have a full house, so as you can see, it's going to be important during the day that everybody tries to get back in on time after the breaks. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Emilia Djonov, who has been a close friend of the library and the Public Library Network for the last 4 years. She's probably learned much more about libraries than she ever anticipated she would, and it's been an absolute delight to collaborate. So welcome, Emilia.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's launch of the Early Literacy Framework for Public Libraries in New South Wales. And it is great to see so many familiar faces in the audience. It makes me feel a bit less nervous about presenting the framework. Thank you all for coming. I'd like to start this day by, first of all, introducing the ways in which, talking about the ways in which the research project that this started as has informed the framework. And you would all have a copy of the framework with you, I think. So throughout the day, we will be referring to different sections of the framework. But first things first, I'd first like to acknowledge the people who have been involved in this project. Cameron Morley and Kate O'Grady approached me via Philippa Scarf to see what we can do to provide some research informed framework, some tools that are informed by research to allow public libraries to articulate what they do quite well and have been doing for many, many years. Okay? And then we've been guided every step of the way by Miley Joseph, who's been there at the end of the phone, but also coming to Macquarie for meetings to help with all sorts of questions, because there is so much, as Miley said, that I've learned about public libraries, and I think all three of us have learned about public libraries, that you don't know if you just know your own public library. So we've learned a lot, and I'd like to thank these people from State Library for initiating the project and making it possible and allowing us to sort of step into this learning journey. These are the people who have been involved in the project from Macquarie. Associate Professor Jane Torr and Dr. Marie Stenglin have been working alongside me over the last 3 or so years at least. But we've also had research assistants come and go to help with different aspects of the project. So Dr. Liam Pham and Dr. Katya Numbers, who were not doctors when they were doing some work on a project, they have helped with the design of the surveys and also with the statistical analysis. Natalie Papailinas, I'd like to mention in particular, because she applied for 2 Macquarie University internships. One was the Merit Scholar Scheme and the other one was the Macquarie University Research Internships, because she saw the brief description of the project and she was so excited. She's one of our undergraduate highly achieving students, and so she's been able to work on this project as well. Dr. Catherine Martin, who has expertise in children's theatre, and also she writes, she's a scriptwriter for High Five. So she's been looking at the sessions and helping us with the multimodal analysis, and Amy Gill has helped with the analysis of the interviews that we conducted, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. I forgot to mention that Associate Professor Jane Torr is our perhaps sort of person on the team with the longest expertise in early language and literacy development, in research in early language and literacy development, and Dr. Marie Stenglin has expertise as a museum educator. She worked for the Australian Museum, but also very importantly, she is someone who is very interested and has researched the use and design of spaces in museums as well as other informal education contexts. Okay. And the biggest thank you goes to a lot of people here in the audience, to all the New South Wales Library staff who participated in the project, and to all the children and caregivers at the early literacy sessions that were included in this project. Okay, so this started as a research project, and the aim was to develop what we would describe as a context-sensitive framework that public libraries can employ to design and evaluate early literacy programs in ways that best support children and families in their communities. So in terms of participants and data, we started with a statewide survey of New South Wales public library staff involved in children's programming, and we received 133 responses. And this helped us a lot to get an overview of what was important for public libraries, and also to get a better understanding of what it is that they offer to children and their families. And we're focusing on children here from birth to the beginning of school. Okay, so birth to 5 or so. We then were able to also get expressions of interest for participating in stage 2 of the project, which involved video recording and observing storytime sessions, the regular early literacy storytime sessions, so your baby rhyme time, or ones that are for babies specifically, as well as storytime for preschoolers and mixed age storytimes, those that New South Wales Public Library Services offer on a regular basis. There are other sessions as well that are very important, but our framework and our research project did not focus on those. So 11 country library services were involved and 7 from metropolitan Sydney. And in many cases, we observed sessions and video recorded sessions in several branches for the same service. So altogether 57 storytime sessions. And with every single session, just when we thought we've seen it all, there was something slightly different and something slightly new and interesting that we thought, this really shows you how much we can learn. Even early childhood educators can learn from what libraries do to serve their communities in the best possible ways. Okay. At the end of each of the sessions that we video recorded, we asked parents and caregivers at these sessions to complete a survey, which ended up being quite long. It was 6 pages long, 24 questions, and only one person did not complete it. People love their libraries. Every single person completed that survey. And I don't know that I would have bothered with a baby or a toddler, but they did. And that was invaluable for helping us understand who these people are who take their children to early literacy sessions, to storytime sessions, and also to understand more about their literacy practices at home as well as their library use. Okay. And after each session, we recorded interviews. We conducted interviews with the session's presenters. In some cases, these presenters were also library managers, but we also had sort of sometimes separate interviews with library managers to be able to understand different perspectives. So altogether, we adopted a mixed methods approach. So we had quantitative and qualitative survey analysis, qualitative analysis of interviews, and also multimodal analysis of the session. What multimodal means is that we paid attention not just to how language was used or just to the language of picture books, for example, but also to all the different communication modes that were involved. So the way that people use gestures, the way the different props were incorporated into story time, and the way that the space was, in many cases, adjusted to better suit the purposes of story time. Okay. Now, State Library has provided a web page on which the framework as well as the literature review that I'll mention in a moment and the results from these surveys and interviews some of them have come out, and there are a couple of reports that I'm putting the finishing touches to, so hopefully by the end of the year they'll be up there as well. All right, so how is our project different from other related Australian projects that involve libraries or are in fact initiated by libraries? I would say that our project is different in that it started first as a research project, and it is not directly involved in advocacy or direct work with families. So it didn't involve a book gifting scheme or anything like that, which a lot of these other projects do. So they are actually directly advocating for the value of libraries, for the value of early literacy and reading to families. But we do hope that we would have an impact to help you be able to advocate for the great work that many library services are doing by helping you articulate using research that supports what you do. And you know, often people have come to us and said, oh, I'm doing that and it seems to be effective. But very often people need the language to be able to articulate why it is effective and to be able to then better argue for why they need funding for this or that program or for this or that initiative that they have. So we're hoping that our project will complement these other projects in this way. What we also wanted to do for our project is to complement a lot of the already existing literature. Much of it is by the American Library Association, and it gives you plans for story time. It gives you some tips for story time. Some of them sort of draw some links to research, but again, it is not sort of research driven as it were necessarily. And the other problem with having ready-made plans is that it doesn't allow you to draw on your own professional experience and expertise, on your own professional judgment. So while they're great to have as a resource, we think that in most cases, you will be looking at these things and thinking, oh, well, I might need to adjust this or that. Okay, so another resource that we are complementing in that work is by focusing specifically on early language and literacy, and specifically on story time sessions, and especially the connection between language and literacy. We are complementing work like this now some 20 years old? No, not quite 20. 90-something was published. Book by Joe Potter, which gives you a lot of very practical tips on how do I present an effective storytime session and how do I prepare for it, including how do I build the confidence as a presenter. So these are all great resources you can draw on. Just as we were finishing our framework, this book came out, Supercharged Storytimes, and it is another great resource. But we also had some reservations about it. It is based on a very large-scale intervention that was oriented to providing evidence of and improving the quality of early literacy sessions at public libraries. And it was built into the University of Washington's Library and Information Science postgraduate program. So a lot of people were involved, a much larger project than ours, as you can see from the infographic here. Okay. And like us, they incorporated in their framework principles for effective pedagogy, educational principles, such as intentionality, interactivity, and scaffolding, and a focus on early language and literacy domains. So we found that really inspiring. But what we had reservations about was that there seemed to be little consideration for socio-cultural variation within and across library settings. Because what this framework gives you are those general principles, and we too have focused on providing you with concepts, with tools that you can use to think about how best to design your early literacy sessions and how best to evaluate them given what your community, what your library community is like. But we found that what they did is they offered behaviors that presenters can adopt organised according to early literacy domain. In this case, I've used an example from alphabetic knowledge, exploring with letters, and said that basically if you have even just one child demonstrate the corresponding behaviour to each of the educator or adult behaviours, then that can count as evidence of impact. I think we need to be very careful with statements like that, knowing that there is a lot of variation among the children who attend story time. And so we can't say that just because I've done something and I've pointed to the letters in the book, I've pointed to the print, and a child is starting to point to print in picture book, that this is the result of me doing it. We don't know what experiences these children have at home. So we need to be very careful. But we also, as early childhood educators, we also thought we like to start with the children and with what we know about children's early language and literacy development, and then think about how we can support those milestones, children to achieve those milestones, what we can do to support that. Okay. So what then do we mean by saying we hope to have provided a context-sensitive framework? The ways in which we hope to have achieved that is by incorporating all these different perspectives into the project and then letting them inform the framework. Okay? So library staff perspectives, review of relevant research, family perspectives, and also all these observations, video recording and analysis, in some cases very detailed analysis of early literacy sessions. So all of those have informed our work on the framework. Okay. And one of the things that has helped us with all of the different components of the frameworks, the framework that you can see on the right-hand side, is the literature review that we conducted. The literature review included both review of the professional and research literature from library and information services perspective and science perspective. So looking at literature that would help us understand children's services in public libraries, as well as public libraries more generally, and also then looking at how that informs our ability to draw on early language and literacy research, so that we can say something about public libraries as places that can support early language and literacy. So we can think of the implications. Okay. But let's first look at the library staff perspectives. One of the first things that happened before I had even developed the proposal for the project, as I was working on it, Kate O'Grady said, well, why don't you come to Blacktown, where the young people at libraries meeting will be held in, I think it was March 2014, end of March 2014. And she also had the great idea that we give people a piece of paper where they can write what they hope our project can give them. And we've tried very hard to sort of keep that in mind as we were working on the project. But there are two main things that came in almost every single of those 20 pieces of paper that we got back from all these participants. People wanted recognition for the work that they do, and people also wanted research-based professional learning about early language and literacy, and the two are related. We think that having that professional learning, having a research-based understanding of how we can support early language and literacy will allow you to get that recognition, to better advocate for what they do, for what you do, and for what works, and then get recognition for your professional judgment and all the work that has been going. So these are some of the responses we got, and you can see that they really overlap. So these are mainly recognition, help gain credibility with our councils, fellow staff, and the community, raising profile of children's librarians and their roles, statistical analysis of contribution public libraries are making, recognition of the amount of work and effort library staff invest in early literacy, being relevant to community. And these ones, learning about early literacy, understanding gaps in early literacy programming in libraries, and identifying good models in current practices. To have an understanding of what is important in early literacy programming and how libraries of different staff levels can provide best programs they can for bigger and smaller groups of children. And this has been a key challenge that we've had to address in this project. Supportive research in early literacy development. People also wanted practical things. And things like advice on how to select appropriate books, for example. Okay? And we kept hearing that in the interviews, we kept seeing it in the survey, but also here very early on. We are not early childcare experts. Are we doing the right things? Okay. Okay. So the survey, some of the things we learned from that first survey that I said 133 library staff involved in children's programming completed. They showed us that early literacy sessions, what you might call story time, emerged as central among libraries' efforts to support early language and literacy in their communities. Of the 133 respondents, only 5 worked at libraries that didn't offer these. Okay? And again, it may be to do with how we defined it. So maybe they offered something that they saw somewhat different. But another interesting thing is that the people involved in early literacy sessions, they ranged across different kind of positions, so library manager, director, as well as library officer, assistant, branch librarian, children's librarian. And not only that, but they were involved in multiple roles. A lot of people were involved in at least 3 roles, such as resourcing these sessions, developing them, presenting them, and also evaluating them. Okay. We also asked people about the professional competences that are important for preparing and presenting effective early literacy sessions. And all of the ones we had suggested, they saw as important to very important. Only the grey bits show you where people thought it was not so important. Okay? Communicate effectively during early literacy sessions. Have knowledge, familiarity, and appreciation of appropriate reading materials for children, and so on, including have knowledge of early language and literacy, difference and disability, and so on. An important response to an open-ended question we asked was that, in addition, staff need a strong understanding of how early literacy programs run by public libraries differ from those run in early childhood centres. For example, programs run to educate parents on the importance of reading, singing, talking to babies, and modelling how this is done. And we also asked about the priorities, benefits, and challenges of early literacy sessions. Okay, so you can see there's some overlap between the priorities and benefits. Okay, so in both cases, people said a key priority and a benefit that children and families get is that they want to support children's literacy, but also other learning. And so we have to appreciate that even though we have focused on language and literacy in this framework and in the work that we've done, there are other purposes and other kinds of learning that Storytime also supports. Okay. Very importantly, one of the benefits library staff said early literacy sessions offer is that they offer children a sense of developing a love of reading and a love of books. That came across a lot. A key priority was engagement, and that's very important. But also educating parents about early literacy and promoting the library. Okay. Often, these sessions draw people to the library, so they actually serve a broader purpose in the community as well. A key priority was also outreach and community engagement. In terms of challenges, though, people wanted us to recognize that the key challenge was limited resources, including space, 3-dimensional physical space. But also limited resources then means that people have to make tough decisions sometimes. So one of the elephants in the room that we kept coming across was craft. Given the limited resources, can we really afford to spend so much funding and time and so on craft? So again, many people thought, well, that is important. And we hope to give them the tools to articulate why craft is important. Okay, but also how they can do craft to manage the limited resources. Another important challenge was recognition by families, other staff and community, and need for an early learning and literacy framework. So that whole idea, we're not teachers. Okay? We had to be very careful to acknowledge that, while we were also learning so much from what you do know, and people do see you as educators, and libraries are an educational context as well as a community hub. Okay. So as I said, we decided to focus on early literacy sessions, and what that survey, as well as the review of the literature, also told us is that they serve three aims: to promote children's language and literacy development directly through children experiencing these sessions, to build a community of avid readers and library users, and also, very importantly, to educate families about reasons and ways to support literacy from birth. Okay. The literature review is very important companion to that framework. But at the same time, we are aware that the literature review is very long, and so you may want to dip in and out of it, or you may want to refer to it as you need. But I want to stress that we started by really reviewing what the literature told us about children and libraries, and this is where we had to read a lot of research in journals from the library and information science field. We then looked at, also reviewed literature on early language and literacy development, including socio-cultural variation, including things like gender, Aboriginal perspectives, as well as children speaking or learning English as an additional language. So that then we could, at the end of that literature review, but also throughout, think about public libraries as early literacy environments. We could understand how that research could inform public libraries, given that a lot of that research is not from that kind of setting. A lot of that research comes from, interactions within the family environment, maybe in early childhood settings, but not in settings such as the libraries. So some of the things we've learned quite early on is that we need to be mindful of both the strengths and benefits that public libraries can offer, and use those, really take a strengths-based perspective to think about ways we can address all the challenges. And there are significant challenges, particularly if we have a very narrow understanding of research and a very narrow understanding of early language and literacy. So in terms of strengths and benefits, public libraries offer resources that all families can access and professional support in locating and using these. Another benefit is that library staff tend to be very, very familiar with their local communities. So how can we draw on that familiarity to develop early literacy sessions, for example, or other efforts to support early language and literacy in that community that would work for that community? So the resources are great, but we also know that people use these resources in different ways. They participate in different ways. Research by Neumann and Celano in public libraries in the United States looked at two libraries. They did an ethnographic study of two libraries in Philadelphia, where they both were part of a project to see, let's see if we can provide exactly the same resources in both libraries to level the playing field, as it were. But what I noticed is that people were using these resources in very different ways that reflected different orientations to literacy, different orientations to language, different orientations to parenting, and so on and so forth. So we really can't assume that just by having the resources, we will have the kind of impact that we want to have. Spaces that serve many functions, including that of community hubs. People might use the library as a meeting point. Someone might go to the library because this is where they feel safe, and it's a free space they can go. Safe from a range of things, be it bullying, be it domestic violence, and so on. So we really need to think about how these spaces, and in a lot of the interviews that we conducted, in a lot of the conversations that we've had with library staff who participate in the project, they said it's very important for us that people feel safe here and that this is a welcoming, inviting space. Okay? That also then presents various challenges. The need for flexible design, and also for ways that we can attract hard-to-reach community members. How do we make people who are not so confident when it comes to reading and books feel welcome in the library? welcome to story time. Need for flexible design so that the same space can be effective for children who want to sing and dance during story time, but also then, for people to chat and meet and borrow books and so on. We also need to think of ways to encourage and to also document borrowing and other use. That's a lot. That's something that would allow us to show the extent to which, what kind of functions these spaces serve and how effective we are in providing spaces that serve a lot of different functions. And from our perspectives, the greatest strength and benefit was that libraries offer programs for all children from birth, and these are free, with the potential to provide language and literacy-rich environments, but also to support other learning experiences, and also to provide socializing opportunities for families. The challenges associated with evaluating these programs, as well as with designing those programs, and this is a challenge specifically for research of the quantitative type, is that there is so much variability in the frequency and regularity of attendance, in the group size, in the ages of children who attend. Even when a session is targeting a particular age group, that a mother might bring an infant or a baby in a preschool storytime session, and also variation in who brings children to storytime: grandmother, mother, grandfather, maybe childcare educators, nannies, and so on. So another challenge is ensuring appropriate participation by children and caregivers alike. If we take a strengths-based perspective, we acknowledge that it can be difficult and caregivers can be a bit of a challenge, but we also try to think, well, how can we turn them into a resource that can help us? Because it is a resource that is there in libraries and isn't there in the early childcare settings. So there are things in libraries that, early childcare educators can't use as resources to the same extent. But also acknowledging that key thing that we kept hearing: library staff are not teachers. So we cannot evaluate what they do in the same ways that we might evaluate teachers who see the same children every day, or, at least every week, and who have a much different sort of environment. Okay. How am I going for time? So in the literature review, as well as in our thinking, we started by thinking, well, let's first provide people with a definition of early literacy. And a good place to start is the Belonging, Being and Becoming Australia's Early Years Learning Framework. Okay? They say that literacy is the capacity, confidence and disposition to use language in all its forms. Literacy incorporates a range of modes of communication. This is the multimodal perspective we've been trying to take as well, and you do that really well in storytime, including music, movement, dance, storytelling, visual arts, media and drama, as well as talking, listening, viewing, reading and writing. Contemporary texts include electronic and print-based media. But the important thing to note as well is the significance of positive attitudes. Positive attitudes and competencies in literacy and numeracy are essential for children's successful learning. This is very important. Going beyond Australia, the Australian Literacy Educators Association refers to UNESCO's education position paper, and they define literacy as follows. Literacy is the ability to identify, understand, interpret, create, communicate and compute using printed and written and visual materials associated with varying contexts. Literacy involves a continuum of learning to enable an individual to achieve his or her goals, to develop his or her knowledge and potential to participate fully in the wider society. Okay, so it's a powerful tool. But the other thing you would have noticed is that focus on communication, language, but also other forms of communication across varying contexts. That resonates very strongly with the theory of language that we have worked with in this project, which has also informed the New South Wales syllabus and other early literacy understandings in Australia in particular. This is functional theory of language of Michael Halliday, And there are three important ideas in it. Language is people's most valued, shared resource for communication and learning. And I'll explain a little bit more about that further. Communication reflects and shapes the social context. And you can think of social context both in terms of the immediate situation as well as the cultural, the broader socio-cultural context. And communication is always multimodal, so language is only one of the modes. While it is a very important one, it is a very valued one, we also, whenever we communicate, we select from different communication modes. Images, gestures, movement, and so on. Okay? In this situation where I'm communicating face-to-face, I can use gestures that you can see, for example. Okay. And again, a couple of examples. We have learned so much from observing these literacy sessions. Take Blacktown, Max Weber Library. In both cases, we're focusing on sessions for babies or babies and toddlers. It's in outer Sydney. The audience at those sessions is very large. On the days that we observed and video recorded them, there were about 40 or so children and about as many caregivers. Okay, very, very large. Including many grandparents, some with limited literacy, but also perhaps with limited proficiency in English. And also in that area, there were 6 baby rhyme time sessions a week offered at Max Weber Library only, but also 2 at each of the other 4 Blacktown City Libraries branches. Okay. Compare that with Kiama. We did go to Kiama when the floods were on, so things may have been a little bit different. That was in 2015, just after Maitland, so we didn't get the worst of the floods, but we did go to Kiama just after that. So the audience, the size of the audience, or the participants, I should say, was very small. 3 children or 4 children and 3 caregivers, okay? All English speakers. In that library in country New South Wales, we have only, at that time anyway, they had just 1 session for infants and toddlers a month, and they were run as a block of 3 sessions. And there was the understanding that once you have attended all 3 sessions, you have the basic understanding of how you can support your child's early language and literacy development at home. Okay. The way that the presenters of these sessions communicated with these very different contexts of situations, but also these very different socio-cultural contexts, reflected their understanding of the local community, reflected their understanding of the context, and really allowed them to shape the context in a way that best suited these people who attended the baby rhyme time session. In Kiama, there was one-to-one sort of rolling of a bow and singing of a welcome song with introduction of names and so on. You can't do that with 40 children and about as many caregivers. So what we saw in Blacktown was very different. The presenter tried to make eye contact with each child whenever she could, in handing out books for one-to-one reading between children and caregivers, in taking them back, handing out musical instruments, but also in just singing the hello song, just making sure that, some milliseconds are given to everyone. All right, in Kiama there was a lot of explicit advice, even sometimes with references to what researchers say, right? These are some of the things that you can do, and this is why it is good to do them, and so on and so forth. This is not a very suitable option for caregivers who might have limited proficiency in English. And so instead, we had a presenter who modeled things very expressively, projected her voice very well, and it was a much louder session. There was a lot more focus on the presenter. The presenter was just, had a lot of sort of stage presence, if you like. And this suited that context well. So, coming back to language as a tool for learning, Halliday's theory of language that we have taken to think about the relationship between language and the context in which we use it, communication and the context in which we communicate, has been also very instrumental in thinking about language as a tool for learning in general. Halliday, who passed away this year, and has been, as I said, very influential in educational linguistics, in educational contexts, says that as children engage in linguistic interactions, they engage in not just learning language, but also learning about the world, about their world, about other things and experiences through language. And they also learn about language. They learn how it is appropriate to use language in this context as opposed to that context. How to accept a birthday party invitation, and so on. How to communicate effectively. Remember these definitions of literacy that I showed? They had to do with communicating effectively across contexts. Okay. All right. So while we have presented what we hope is a very useful review of research in early language and literacy, we have, in our literature review, always been mindful of that idea that, library staff are busy. Storytime, in many cases, is just one of the things, or actually in all cases, I think, is just one of the things you do. And so, we have tried to provide in each section a summary of what has been presented in that section, what are the key ideas, and in these summaries, what we also try to do in each of them, think about what are the implications for libraries. This is what research tells us. A lot of that research in early language and literacy is not actually considering libraries as a context, but what does that mean for libraries? So, for example, we have emphasized that if learning about letter-sound correspondences, research tells us this requires a lot of systematic teaching and explicit teaching. And yet we know that a child may only have, infrequent opportunities to attend library story time, or in certain settings, there might be just one library story time a month. Then is there really the room to do that explicit systematic teaching? And how much time should we devote to teaching the letters of the alphabet? And why do we do it? We might do it for modeling to parents what they might do. But again, we have considered these things in making recommendations such as those. One's essential contribution libraries could make to the development of children's literacy and lifelong academic success is to help expand their oral language skills, including their vocabulary and their knowledge of the world, by providing access to wide-ranging resources such as stories and non-fiction books, as well as supportive learning environments. The other is to understand that motivation is pivotal and that the love of books develops through access to both relevant books and the rich oral language interactions around these that are responsive to children's interests. So this is our interpretation in each of the sections of the literature review of the detailed review of the research that we have presented in that section. Another example here, the last large section of the literature review looks at specifically the kind of practices that are used in homes and communities to support children's early language and literacy development, with a focus on those practices that we also observed in early literacy storytime sessions. Okay? So there are other practices that we observed that we haven't been able to include, mainly in some cases because there isn't much research on them. There were some cases in which we saw drama, in which we saw play being incorporated, role-playing and so on. But we focused on singing and nursery rhymes, shared picture book reading, oral storytelling, and craft activities, okay? And how they provide rich opportunities to expose children to different ways of using language, to different literacy practices. Okay, so as I said, the literature review has informed all the components of the early literacy framework that we're introducing today. So it is important for us to look at it. you might be wondering how we're incorporating family perspectives. And one important thing to keep in mind is that we asked families in that survey that I said we had 539 people complete out of 540 caregivers who attended the sessions we video recorded. They saw the benefits of early literacy sessions at public libraries as all being important, but the most important one, the one that most of them rated as most very important, was that children enjoy the sessions. So while we focus on early language and literacy, we cannot do that without also considering how can we create engaging sessions. Okay? The availability of free activities for children is another important thing, as well as learning how to read to children and so on. It is also very important to notice that in those sessions, a considerable percentage of children, and that gives you the breakdown according to the session type, whether it was a baby session, babies, toddler in yellow, toddlers in grey, and preschool in green. So even in preschool, we have 39% of the children in those sessions that we observed, they do not attend any early childcare and education setting. So story time could be the only opportunity that they have for experiencing, learning with others, for being in a group setting. So while in a lot of the interviews and also in the survey, a lot of you were concerned that, yes, we need to do a lot more about outreach, and that is definitely something that libraries are putting a lot of focus on, and rightly so. We can't assume that even if we think we're just preaching to the converted, that these sessions therefore don't have an impact, or there's nothing that, these particular children who attend those sessions, if they already come from very rich language and literacy environments at home, that they can't gain something from the sessions. So very important for us to keep this in mind. Okay. And I think I'd like to skip over craft for the moment. That's my pet subject. I'll talk about that later. And just introduce the early language and literacy framework. What we have offered in that framework, as I said, engagement being very important, and keeping in mind what you and the literature told us about the aims of early literacy sessions, the aims of story time. We have incorporated both principles for supporting early learning, these three: engagement, community building, and intentionality, and also principles for supporting early language and literacy learning. But let us first have a look at those. Okay. So engagement. We cannot underestimate the value of a smile, the value of a consistent routine that would make children feel welcome. Okay? Starting with a welcome song, finishing with a goodbye song, smiles and positive reinforcement of the kind of behaviors you want to see in your early literacy sessions. You can see people smiling, you can see people participating in those sessions, and also in one of the sessions we observed at Parks, they had a play activity where the session had books about doctors and taking care of each other, and you can see the children here taking care of the library staff presenting the session, one of the library staff presenting the session. Okay. Engagement is very important, particularly because you may have children who are coming to your session for the very first time ever. This might be the very first time they're ever entering a library or a similar kind of setting. And you want them to come again. So not only does there have to be a strong engagement created during the session, but it has to be so strong that it makes people want to come again, that they carry it home and they want to come again. Community building. And there are two types of communities here. Community of readers and library patrons. How do you create that sense of we all value early language and literacy? We all value reading. We all value the library. Books, perhaps, as an important symbol still, but also the other resources that the library offers. Okay? But also a community of peers and colleagues. This is very important. And in the framework, we have built in tools for encouraging you to really work with your library, with the community of your peers and colleagues, so that they get to appreciate what it is, even if they're not involved so directly in early literacy sessions, what it is that you do, why it is important, and how much effort it actually is, and how much time it actually takes. And that you're not just playing with children, even if you are playing with children, which is also very important. Okay, so we have offered this tool, which we've called the Library Community Analysis Template, and which Marie will talk us through in the final session that we look at how to use the framework. And we've asked you to really think about, draw on your own knowledge and on other resources that tell you more about the community. And think about what makes my community that my library serves unique, and what are the implications, therefore, for how I can support early language and literacy. And ideally, that should be done as a team. And it shouldn't just include people involved in early literacy sessions in large libraries. Okay. Intentionality is the next principle. Because while we appreciate that when you are in the role of library staff, you are not teachers, even though some of you do have teaching qualifications in, early childhood, in some cases even. Intentionality is important because you are educators, and libraries are a very important informal education setting that is free to the community. And as we saw, some children, that may be the only setting in which they have access to really rich language and literacy environments, to being part of a community of people who value early literacy, who value the library, and so on, being part of a group setting as well. Okay? So we encourage you through the framework to adopt a deliberate and also age-appropriate focus, and we'll talk through the tools that we've built in to enable that. A deliberate focus in that we need you to focus on specific early language and literacy domains, and we have outlined what these are and how they are related, and also given you ideas of what is appropriate to expect of children at a certain age. Okay? We sometimes this deliberate focus and scaffolding, what is also very important, what good educators do, which means providing support and recognizing that learning happens incrementally. Learning happens in stages. And until someone can do something independently, we need to provide that scaffold, that support. That someone is the children, but also the caregivers. Start with your expectations of the session. Explain why you have these expectations, if appropriate to your context, and reinforce them. So that deliberate focus, that attention to scaffolding is evident, for example, when you see a library presenter who has got the soft toy, but the soft toy is not just lying around, they're holding it, modeling for parents how they can read with their babies and toddlers. Okay? We also see that when you have theme-based story time, the very careful selection of resources, but also the very careful thinking about what should I take out next, and how many things can children focus on at the same time. Okay? Differentiation is also important, particularly in mixed stage story time, but always in education. Not only do these children come with different abilities, and from different socioeconomic and cultural and linguistic backgrounds. But in mixed age storytime, you also have children who are different ages. So we need to think about, okay, well, if I'm planning to do this or that activity, what can I build in for those children who need more time to get into it and to participate with the group? What can I do, or how can I at the same time make it more complex for those children who are finding that easy, who have the experience of coming to story time, they know their routines, they know what we expect, and so on and so forth. So you need to think about that, and I think the tools that I hope that the tools that we have offered in the Early Language and Literacy framework will help you with that. So differentiation is important, and it's also interesting here to think about differentiation and also all the ethical considerations. I remember a story time that I took my children to. They're 3 years apart. One of them was 4 at the time. No, one of them was 5 and the other one was 2. And there were 2 different sets of craft activities. For the younger ones, there was just coloring in. For the older ones, there was something a bit more complex. The younger one really wanted to do the one for the older one. What would you do in a situation like that? Can you have an open-ended activity that provides opportunities for children to make it as complex or as simple as they like? All right, so that they don't feel that they're doing very different things, even though they are doing it to the best of their ability. And very importantly, the other broad education principle is reflexive practice. We ask you to think very carefully about planning your sessions, how they relate to the community, your library community, and then ideally always do that with colleagues and peers. And not just reflect of what worked well and what didn't and why, but also think forward, be reflexive. Think about what can we change, what can we try? Even if everything seems to be working, why don't we try something new? Okay. We've also offered principles for supporting early literacy. Okay? And these are the key principles, the overarching principles that you can relate back to the definitions of early literacy that I presented a little bit ago. Language and literacy learning support each other. Literacy, like all communication, is multimodal. Positive dispositions are key to success both in language and in literacy learning. Early literacy is the foundational experiences and knowledge that children build before they learn to read and write in conventional terms. And it is the responsibility of many people. Both formal early childhood education settings and informal education contexts can support early language and literacy. And this is why, while library staff may not be teachers, children actually often call them the teacher. Parents often do, and people do expect to be able to use the advice that you have to offer, both on resources available and books that are suitable for their children and other resources perhaps, but also advice on early language and literacy and how they can develop that. And I've seen, in Newcastle, for example, I saw Julie having to spend quite a bit of time after a session talking to a parent who was really interested in, we did this during the session, so how can I do that at home? And so on. All right, so these are the language and literacy domains, the specific domains that we have focused on in the framework that research tells us are important foundational literacy and language skills. And we can think of them as broadly divided into 2 groups. Those that are decoding oriented, think of knowing the letters of the alphabet and the sounds that they make, what is known as alphabet knowledge, alphabet and letter knowledge, which there is lots of research that shows it is very important for learning to read. phonological awareness, children's ability to attend to the sound patterns in language, and also to divide speech into sound units of different sizes, recognize separate words, recognize onset and rhyme within words, syllables within words, and so on. Being able to clap the correct number of times for the number of syllables in their name. Concepts of print, knowing how to handle a book, but also knowing how books function, what role do they serve, and also knowing how books of different types may be organized. Okay, so you have a table of contents maybe in an information book sometimes, or an index, and so on. So, of course, as you can see, while these are the kind of skills that we focus on a lot when children are learning how to read, the decoding skills, some of them, like concepts of print, are actually very important also for being able to comprehend text. Something that we focus on much, in some ways, the focus is more significant on reading to learn in the later grades of primary school. The problem is that often the comprehension skills that you can see on the right-hand side, the oral language and vocabulary that children have, the oral language skills and how many words and what types of words do they know, the background knowledge that allows them to comprehend text, to understand what you are reading to them or what they are later reading themselves, and the motivation to engage with print. Having favorite authors, having favorite activities that involve these kinds of print-based literacy practices, these ones are essential for learning to read, but they are skills that are very important for being able to learn from reading, learn through reading. Okay? And the two support each other. So both are very important for us to attend to. Okay. One of the issues with the decoding skills and the fact that in the early grades of school, of primary school, there is a lot of focus on decoding and learning to read, is that sometimes we lose focus of the importance of the comprehension skills. And this is something that research tells us the foundations for these comprehension skills, the oral language and literacy, the background knowledge, engagement with books, enjoying these reading experiences, for example. This is something that starts very early in life, and differences among children are noticeable very early in life. And also this is what, when we get to 4th grade and the focus shifts to being able to read, now that we've learned how to decode text, being able to read in order to learn, the gaps in these comprehension skills that we then notice are very difficult to address because learning is incremental. Children learn about the world, they develop this background knowledge, they develop through various opportunities to interact with others, they develop the skills to communicate effectively using language and other communication modes across a range of different contexts over time, through everyday, lots of everyday enriching interactions with others. So it is very important that we don't lose sight of that. We don't lose sight of the comprehension skills. We don't lose sight of these things that we actually think libraries can really, really help with. Even for the child who only attends one ever storytime session. If that session creates an experience through which the child can learn about something, let's say, I don't know, let's say Christmas, whatever it might be, pirates, mice, cats, they would have still benefited from that one session. They would have still learned some words. They would have still learned something about cats. So it is very important that while there is a lot of debate focusing on decoding, and while it is undoubtedly very important in learning to read, that we don't lose sight of all of those skills that are essential for being able to learn from books, learn from reading. Okay, I think, so what we've offered here for each of those domains that I showed, for each of the 6, what we've called literacy domains, is a table that shows you what you can expect from children across the different ages that we think a lot of libraries offer, in some cases, separate storytime sessions for, and then how educators can support this kind of learning. So this is one way in which our framework is a bit different from the supercharged Storytimes framework. But also notice at the bottom, notes specific to my community, because some of the strategies we've suggested might not work. And this is where we have learned a lot from what we've observed, from what you have taught us through the interviews, and we want you to draw on your professional judgment. Okay. Then we have the planning template for storytime sessions, in which again we've asked you to think about whether you're going to use a theme or not, what the target age group might be, the literacy domains, the objectives for children's learning. Here we want you to just think of, per storytime session, maybe just 1 or 2 literacy domains that you're going to focus on. And then what strategies you can use to support children, what tips you might be able to give to parents and caregivers. Think about the books, props and resources and equipment, and the spatial organization. And a lot of you are doing that, and in some cases, I think East Maitland was one of the examples. We saw excellent examples of people having developed their own similar kinds of templates to have that recorded so that then they can reflect and share these resources with their colleagues. Support ideas for younger children, extension of ideas for older children, what we talked about with differentiation, but also evaluating the session and thinking about implications for future planning. I think that has introduced the key components of the framework and some of the ideas behind it. And thank you for your attention. I think we probably don't have time for questions at the moment, but we will have time for questions at the end. And also, you know, all 3 of us are around all day. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. That was a lot to start thinking about, wasn't it? Great information. We're breaking now for morning tea, which is in the room behind us. So you can go out this door or you can go out this door. If everyone could please try to be back here sitting down for 11 so that we can start on time, that would be wonderful. Thank you.